Hey, Brian.
Hey, Chris, how's it going?
Good to see you, my friend. How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic.
Nice.
So, let's see. We're at 3:02. How about we get it started?
I'm ready. Let's do
Fan-
it.
So, hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We are in the 3 o'clock session, which we've named uh, Evolving Identities, Embracing Change, or How We Embrace Change. And I'm joined today by entrepreneur Brian Helfman, who is the founder and CEO of Third Nature, formerly known as Startup Island. I would otherwise have you introduce yourself, but I think we're going to get to know a little bit about you and your journey, and I'll sprinkle a little bit of my journey in there as well, along the path of time we spent together today. But thank you for being here and taking the time and sharing with us, how change has sort of affected your entrepreneurial journey in, sort of the beginning, middle, and where we are today currently. Of
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for having me. And if I could just say one quick thing on
course.
I'm still not used to introducing myself as Brian from Third Nature. It kind of feels like I recently changed my last name. We get so attached to this identity of I'm Brian from Startup Island. That was how I introduced myself for over 6 years. And the rebrand to Third Nature just happened a little over 2 months ago. So still getting used to it. And it does feel like a little part of my identity, not my whole identity. And I think that's an important distinction, right? But a part of my identity that was Startup Island is now no longer part of my identity. And now it's Third Nature. But yeah, I'm excited to get into it.
I mean, you sort of touched on where I think I'd love to start, which is first and foremost, what is change, or how do you define change, and how does that sort of weave itself into specifically when you're starting something, you're the founder, you're there on minute one of day one, um, how that plays into who you are, what you are, and how you interact with other people. I think that'd be a great place to start and get some context.
Yeah, sure. The first thing that came to mind when you asked the question, change is constant, right? Change is always happening within us and around us. Um, we don't always notice it, but over time, when you look back, you see it. You're like, oh, I guess when I reflect on where I was this time last month or last year, like now I can see the change because it's happening slowly on a day-to-day basis. Um, and I think a lot of times, and this was the case with us in the reason why we decided to rebrand from Startup Island to Third Nature wasn't to change anything about it. Wasn't like when we rebranded, we changed everything. The rebrand was the goal was to better describe and encompass what we had naturally changed to do. So we started Startup Island now almost 7 years ago. It was very much a startup boot camp in Costa Rica. And I know Costa Rica is not an island, but we were, playing on like the exotic
Right.
theme. And we were doing summer camp weekends. We were doing New Year's trips in the DR and Mexico. And so we scaled this business. And it started to naturally change a lot as we grew, as we learned more about the real value that we were providing people. So the rebrand, the change in the name was meant to, again, better describe the way we had shifted and what we were actually doing now, because we're no longer doing what we set out to do when we first put the name Startup Island on the business. And I think in business with branding, it's important to not confuse people. Like I think a lot of people put too much emphasis on the importance of a name, but we rebranded because Startup Island was just, it wasn't accurately describing what we were doing anymore. So again, it was less us making this big change all of a sudden. It was rather us seeing the change that we had naturally embraced, and then putting a better name on the business to reflect that.
Connecting the dots, so to speak, so that it's a clear straight line, or as clear
Yeah.
and as straight as you could get it. No, that makes total sense. And I think if I'm looking at the same question and someone asks me, what has changed to you? My answer, I think, after many years of going through many changes, personally, professionally, like you come to this persona, this brand that is you, that you are it is you. I call it the Mr. T effect. Like, Mr. T was always Mr. T. He was never really Terry. He was the guy that wore a whole bunch of chains and was that. And didn't know anything else except that.
I didn't even know his name was Terry.
Yeah. Yes, it actually is. True fact. My answer to the question, what has changed, is change is progress. Change is the thing that progresses you on many levels all at once. It's never a straight line or linear. We try to make it that way because that's how we understand things. But essentially, for me, it's a mindset. And the way I could categorize that, or the analogy I could make, is if anyone here today was listening to this, think of the things that you wanted to achieve last year, or go back 5 years, go back 10 years. Are those things the same? I would probably guess that they're not. And what allows you to get to where you want to go is the ability to embrace that, to embrace change, to know that you are not going to be the same person when you start, or when you're in the middle, or when you eventually get up to the point in which you want to be at, the goal. And it's a mindset that gets you prepared for that, which I think is a great place to go, with this conversation, which is the start. How did this all start for you? What was your life like that allowed entrepreneurship to either be there from day one, or kind of grow into you, so to speak?
Yeah. So I was labeled as a disruptive child in school. I always felt like I was being forced to fit into a box that was, like, I guess we could call it the traditional education system, that factory education system that was created over 100 years ago for this industrial age that we've kind of outgrown in a lot of ways. But I certainly did not fit in. At least, I had always had a good group of friends, but I didn't fit into school. And it got to the point where in 6th grade, I was diagnosed with ADHD, and I was put on ADHD medication. And that was, again, to fit me in the box, to force me to adapt to the way that school was done.
Right.
And the way that class was taught. Not to think, like, no one took the time, myself included, to ask, well, why is he so disruptive? Is he being challenged in the classroom? Because I was always like a whiz at math. Like, I got good grades in most of my classes, but especially math. And I wasn't really disruptive in math because I loved what I was learning, and I felt like I was being challenged. It was, in the classes that I thought were boring, I was disruptive because I thought other people were bored too, and I wanted to, like, be entertaining. I wanted to
Liven it up a bit.
Laugh. And in retrospect, I look at my 11-year-old self, and I see all these things about him, about me, because those things are still a part of me. They're part of my essence. That make so much sense given what I'm doing now. But I was never encouraged to, follow my curiosity. I was never encouraged to like, oh, you're interested in this. Let's like explore that. It was, no, you're not supposed to be interested in that. You're supposed to, sit in a desk, pay attention, and, just do what's asked of you, and, go from there to college to the, job, the 5% raise year after year. Like,
Right.
it was like my whole life was kind of presented to me as like, this is the path that you're supposed to take. And none of it felt right to me. I just didn't want to fit into that, but I felt like I was forced to fit into that. And it really wasn't until I was like 23 years old. And, I went off to college. I left home for college. And that definitely was an experience that allowed me to like get outside of that a little bit and learn more about myself, establish more of like who I was and what I wanted. But not radically so. I was still kind of pursuing a relatively traditional path at that point. But after I graduated college, when I was 23 years old, my dad passed away, and he was only 55. And when he died, it was like kind of this wake up call, this worldview shattering wake up call that told me, life is short. And I just had this urge to really get out of that box. And I felt like I finally honestly had permission to get out of the box, to figure out who I was and what I wanted out of this life, and prioritize that, not, just sit back and let life come to me. And because again, I wanted to, I wanted something more than how I was currently spending my time. So that eventually led me to entrepreneurship. And I started my first business a couple years later and built that for about 3 years. And what I loved about being an entrepreneur was, managing a team, being creative on a daily basis. Again, starting to lean into more of those things about me that had always been true that, lay dormant because they weren't serving me in a traditional education system or in a traditional corporate job.
Sure.
Starting to lean back into that creativity. But over the course of the 3 years building that first business, I kind of lost the passion for the problem that we were solving. I was working crazy hours. I was working constantly. And that business had really become my identity. But another thing I loved was kind of being someone that other aspiring entrepreneurs would come to for advice and mentorship and coaching with their own businesses. And one of those people was actually he would become my co-founder at Startup Island. So he came to me with the idea to bring a group of entrepreneurs from New York to Costa Rica and kind of see what happens. We were living in New York at the time, and I had a growing network of entrepreneurs in my community. So this seemed like an exciting opportunity. But the more we talked about it, the more I kind of started to realize that this was everything that I had always been good at and always been interested in, kind of rolled into one. Again, it was mentoring and coaching other aspiring entrepreneurs. It was also utilizing the power of travel as a means of personal and professional growth.
Right.
I had a couple travel experiences during and shortly after college and shortly after my dad passed away that really helped me figure things out for myself, figure out, again, who I am and what do I want. And so I thought, well, maybe we could create a travel experience for early stage entrepreneurs, focused on, leadership, creativity, community, mindfulness. And somehow we convinced 16 entrepreneurs to join us on that first trip. This was back in March 2016. And, the rest is kind of history. I think like halfway through that week, I was like, yep, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. But again, I didn't sit back and think to myself, well, what do I want to do for the rest of my life? Or I was having those thoughts, but it was more the action, the getting out there and experimenting. And again, I started a whole other business, built a whole other business for 3 years before doing Startup Island, what I believe to be my life's work. So there was a lot of experimentation during childhood, during college, after college, into my adult life that ultimately helped me gain the clarity and confidence to do what I'm doing now.
So, I mean, there's so many things to touch on inside there. And, from what you shared, it seems our stories are sort of on opposite ends of the spectrum where, um, I come from an entrepreneurial family. So I never really saw my parents go to work for anyone else except for themselves, so we could, get new shoes for school that year or play sports or things of that nature. And sports were really kind of like my job all the way going through elementary school into high school into college. I'm a former professional athlete, and then I got hurt, and then went and played another sport professionally, professional beach volleyball, and moved to Southern California, originally from the East Coast. And so it seems like as you're talking about this journey that you had, we sort of have been intertwining our paths along a very similar trajectory, but just different ends of the spectrum. And it's really interesting because a lot of times in there, for me, at least personally, when I got hurt and I couldn't play sports anymore, that was an inflection point for me where I had to say, do I embrace this, or like, what do I do? This is going to affect everything in my life. And so I'm curious, if you could talk about those times or some of those points in which you remember during this whole process of embracing change and transformation, and that box that you said you felt like for a long time in the early stages of your life that you didn't fit into that box. What did you do, or what tools did you use, or what avenues did you explore in order to help you get beyond those sticking points?
Yeah. I mentioned travel. That was a big thing. And travel, I think, is obviously something that's not always accessible, right? I mean, we're coming out of a pandemic. There was a long time there where we couldn't travel. And obviously, going to Costa Rica, going for a lot of people anywhere outside of their hometown, like, requires money and time that not everyone has.
Right.
But when I talk about travel, I'm not just talking about getting on a plane and flying somewhere. I'm talking about anything that you do that gets you out of your day to day. And this could even be a Saturday or a Sunday doing something different, doing something that you don't normally do. It could be on a Monday, taking a slightly different path to work, right? If you walk to work, if you drive to work, maybe it's like taking the side roads, or going down a different street as you walk, and being really mindful and noticing your surroundings. And I think it's a combination of that mixed with taking the time to reflect, to actually extract the learning from your lived experience. For me, it was always something that kind of came naturally. Like I mentioned, I was kind of disruptive as a kid, like ADHD brain. I was always like curious about the road less traveled. Like, oh, everyone's going this way. Like, why is no one going this way? I'm going to go that way and like see what's over there.
Right.
To me, that's like the essence of travel. It's doing something different than what you normally do. And again, I think it's important that we're coupling that with taking the time, like carving out the time literally in your schedule to slow down and reflect and digest what you're experiencing. Because I think a lot of us, we have a tendency to go from one experience to the next. A lot of people in the travel industry, especially, like, will, be in this place and then in this place and then running a retreat here and doing a program here. And sometimes it can be hard to find that time to slow down and reflect, but it's really important.
Don't get swept
And
up in the hustle.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And sometimes when things aren't going well, when we're experiencing adversity, the natural or, you know, instinct is to grind harder, to push
Right.
the gas pedal even harder. And I've done that. I've tried that. And for me, it doesn't work. For me, what I really need when I'm not feeling myself, whether it's due to some external adversity or just, I don't know, like I can't really pinpoint why, but I'm just not feeling myself. I have, my toolbox of things that bring me back to me. Again, things like travel and uh, slowing down, reflecting, yoga, meditation, gratitude is big. I have a gratitude journal that I write in every single morning. Having these habits, having this, I call it the me toolbox, the toolbox of things that bring me back to me, that is essential in preventing burnout and overcoming burnout when it comes up, and dealing with adversity when it comes up, moving through adversity. But yeah, I appreciate you sharing about, some of your injuries in sports. And I know that had a big impact on your trajectory, your path, and moving through um, those moments of adversity. I think is oftentimes where the most growth occurs. For me, I mentioned like when my dad died, that was
Yeah.
a major point of adversity in my life. And it was like, I was depressed. I was just, again, not feeling myself, but on the other side of that. And because of the experiences that I immerse myself in after that, um, I grew more than, any other period of my life leading up to that point.
Yeah. I think you hit the center of the target there, Brian. I mean, there are there's no straight line, and anyone that tells you that, I think maybe has been following a path that was preset, and there's there's always a way to do something, and there's always a way to re-envision how to do something, and then there's a way to follow through and execute on a plan, and then you have to be adaptable. You have to understand yourself. You have to understand the people around you, the situation, and I think the really interesting thing that I think I want us to touch on before we end here in like the next 5 minutes or so is, you know you mentioned your me toolbox. I love that. So many different aspects of what you talked about I've tried to grow them into, my own life. And the point you raised about physically, dealing with injuries, that's a tough thing. Losing someone, like a parent, I can't even imagine what that's like. That I've not experienced something like that. But those experiences bring up these really deep emotions, these really deep, um, challenging feelings. And some of the techniques you talked about, um, I think are tools that we can all use that bring us to a specific moment, which is that present moment, and understand that the way forward from here is the way in which we choose to travel and to be mindful. um, I think yoga, meditation, those practices help us be here and now in this moment. And when you do that, when you have the ability to do that, whether it's an emotional or mental trauma, or it's a physical trauma, that helps you get grounded and uh, gives you a brand new jump off point, where maybe the previous trajectory, um, that's over with now, that's sort of complete in a way, but actually, um, is the thing that got you to the point where you now can jump off from a new perspective, a new platform, so that you can continue to grow to what you aspire to be. How much do you think, when you're looking at this from an aspect of some major things that cause people to stop or cause people to not continually embrace change in order to realize that goal, that pinnacle, that objective, even the small ones. Um, how much do you think fear plays a role in that, and how do you go about identifying that and uh, attempting to progress through it or overcome that?
Yeah, fear is huge. And I think fear often comes from isolation, from feeling like you're about to do something that no one's ever done before or that you're not supposed to do, right? Everyone else is going this way. Why are you going that way? But oftentimes, when that's the case, when fear is coming up, it's a sign that you're onto something. And I think it's so important to have a community of people who support you and who understand you and who, even if they're not doing what you're doing, they're also doing their own non-traditional shit. You know, they're
Right.
also like on a path that like maybe you wouldn't go down, but they get it. They get that there's value in doing something different. Um, so having those people in your corner um, who you can just like talk to and sometimes commiserate with and share your fears with. I think it's important to be like open and authentic and sometimes vulnerable about the fear that you're feeling and experiencing. And then once you start talking about it, like, okay, I am afraid that, we won't hit our goals with our upcoming adult summer camp weekend. Once I start talking about it and I'm like, okay, where does that fear come from? What's the worst that can happen? What happens if you don't hit your goals? Or what happens if this business doesn't work out? Like when you prove out the fear, when you start to like go down that path, oftentimes you get to the point where you're like, oh, I guess I'll be okay. I guess the world will keep spinning and I'll learn a lot. Like you start to think about, all right, what's the downside? What's the upside?
Right.
And you start to realize that the fear is something to be felt, but not something to stop you in your tracks. It's a speed bump, not a brick wall.
Right.
I think it's when you try to ignore the fear and suppress it that it lingers and causes inaction. So I think as with any other emotion, it's important that you're like acknowledging it and feeling it and processing it. One last thing I want to mention, because I know we're almost out of time here.
Mm-hmm.
We've mentioned connecting the dots a couple times. And this is not like something I made up, but I once heard someone said to me, it's less about connecting the dots as if like life is linear. Life is more like splatter painting, right? Imagine you have this big canvas and you have all these different paints, and sometimes you're throwing paint against the wall in blue. Sometimes you're like making little red dots. All your experiences, all the different seasons of life are creating more color and texture on the canvas. And sometimes you get really close to the canvas and you can't really see the big picture. But every once in a while, when you take a step back, you start to see how everything's connected. And you start to see, oh, wow, I kind of have a masterpiece like coming together here. And so, yes, like you can't connect the dots looking forward, only looking backward. But the dots are not like this, right? It's more like splatter paint all over the canvas.
Exactly.
And you can't, like, it doesn't all make sense until you step back and actually see the masterpiece for what it is. But it's a product of everything you've experienced and everything you've done. So
I think that's a beautiful place to stop. And I think it could be the message we'll leave everybody with, which is know yourself as well as you can in the moment. And then every once in a while, realize that you have to step back and take a look at what you've done, feel good about it, and then press on. And when you turn around to go forward again, you may be on a different path because you're a different person. But the goal is always what it is that you set out to do in that moment and moving forward with the people you have around you, the support system. So I love talking with you. I wish we had more time, but Brian, thank you so much for joining us today, and it was a pleasure talking with you today, and I hope we can do so again soon.
Same here, Chris. Yeah, really appreciate you kind of moderating and sharing some of your story. And yeah, I feel like we could have went for another couple hours, but I know there's a lot of good stuff happening at this event today. So appreciate, having the time that we did.
Great. I feel the same way. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.